On January 25, 2018, a Chinese-American young adult author named Amelie Wen Zhao announced her plans to release 3 books as part of a series called Blood Heir after securing a deal with Delacorte Press. The first book was scheduled for a summer 2019 release, which was announced to resounding excitement from her fans. Fast forward 1 year and 3 days later. The book release was cancelled, Amelie released an apology on her Twitter page, and online communities dedicated to celebrating YA were thrown into internal discord and turmoil. So, what happened? A few things. First of all, several advanced copies of the book were released. It's difficult to find any concrete information on exactly how many people read the book, but several readers expressed similar concerns with its content, which quickly disseminated to the general public. In particular, the book was criticized for its handling of topics like oppression and slavery. In the world of Blood Heir, a group of people with magical powers called Aphanites are largely feared and enslaved by their non-magical counterparts. The book revolves around an Aphanite princess named Anna who is trying to find her father's killer while avoiding danger at every turn. The book takes inspiration both from Russian and Chinese culture. According to Amelie, her writing about the Aphanites' oppression was a reaction both to the way she had been treated as an immigrant in America and her own experience witnessing slavery in China. Many of the criticisms revolved around a perceived misrepresenting of Russian culture in the book and the idea that the book framed slavery and oppression as blind to skin color. A lot of people felt that because the slavery in the book so closely resembled American slavery, the book shouldn't have removed it from its historical context and placed it instead in the context of people being oppressed for magical powers. After these criticisms started to take hold, Amelie was also accused of screenshotting negative reviews from fans, as well as directly lifting quotes from other fantasy novels such as Lord of the Rings and Six of Crows. The screenshotting accusation comes from a single Twitter user who claims to have been contacted by several anonymous reviewers who had experienced targeting by Zhao. Although many of these initial criticisms did come from people who had read the book and were unhappy with its content, they quickly spread to a wider community of people who, self-admittedly, had not read the book and did not intend to read it. As a result, some of these criticisms went through a sort of Twitter version of telephone. The book portrayed the death of a character who one reviewer described as black, despite the fact that the character's ethnicity was ambiguous in the book, which quickly turned into a host of comments saying the book was bad for explicitly portraying a black character dying in such a manner. Regardless, the critical backlash both to Blood Heir and Amelie herself quickly grew in volume, and on January 28th, Amelie released a statement on Twitter apologizing for her mishandling of slavery in Blood Heir and announcing that she would indefinitely hold off on publishing the book. The handling of Blood Heir has been framed by many people as a symptom of wider cancel culture, an issue that has been talked about at length by a lot of great people and a lot of less than great people. On one hand, a lot of the coverage of what happened with Blood Heir has been dominated by people using the instance to decry any criticism of racist tropes in books. A lot of people only heard about this controversy through an article written by Jesse Singal. The story was also covered by the website Pluralist, who regularly report on very real stories of very real incidents like people being arrested for misgendering trans people. Where did they source that from anyway? Ah yes, the paragon of journalism known as the Daily Mail. You know it's a good time when the conversation about cancel culture is being controlled by these people. On the other hand, the topic has indeed been addressed by some pretty cool people, and I think it would be a mistake to assume that a dislike of leftist cancel culture is endemic only to Peterson or Breitbart types. Most recently, an excellent YouTuber named Angie Speaks made a video called Social Justice Can Be a Clout Game, Here's How to Avoid It, in which she talked about the current incentives in social justice communities to behave profitably and accrue as much social capital as possible, often leading to problems such as cults of personality and people profiting off of outrage and callouts. I'll link it below. Angie's video made some great points about the current status of social justice communities and provided some great analysis as to how we can go about becoming better. That being said, I think there's also something to be said about the way outrage and call-out culture can be disproportionately weaponized against people who are already marginalized in a way that just doesn't happen to more powerful individuals. Now, this is an extremely broad subject to discuss, and it's also a difficult one to handle in good faith. On one hand, you don't want to imply that people should be shielded from criticism of their actions on the basis of their identities, and this is something Angie talks about in her video. If I were to say something shitty and people were to call me out on it, I wouldn't be doing myself or anyone else any favors by just responding with, "Oh, but I'm a queer woman, why are you so desperate to attack queer women?" No one should be immune to criticism of their actions. On the other hand, there is a very real problem of people who are already marginalized facing the brunt of callouts and being cancelled. Once again, this is a very broad topic, and if I were to try and address this entire structural problem, the video would be extremely long. So what I'm going to do instead is focus this in on one very specific place where this issue is continually reproduced, and that's media. Time and time again, works that feature diverse casts or are created by marginalized people are held to much higher standards in online communities than other works. What I hope to do in this video is describe exactly what the problem is, provide a couple of explanations for why this might be the case, and finally talk about how we can move forward from here. So let's get started. So first things first, I'm gonna get a couple of things out of the way. In case you hadn't already figured it out, this video is made for a specific audience and is talking about a specific problem in one particular community. In particular, this is a criticism of how the way we look at media can sometimes operate in left-leaning circles made by a left-leaning person. So just do know that this video is going to be operating under the premise that, generally speaking, having works that feature diverse casts and creators is a good thing. If you don't agree with this and you'd like to watch a video that argues for why these things are good so that you can better understand my argument here, I've provided a couple in the description. With that said, what am I talking about here? There's this trend in leftist communities to respond very differently to certain forms of media. To be clear, I don't think anyone is consciously acting this way. Rather, I think it's a larger issue of how we as a community respond to diverse media as opposed to non-diverse media. Time and time again, we crucify marginalized creators for things that more powerful, non-marginalized creators would barely get any notice for. This also extends beyond the creators themselves to the actual content of the books or movies or shows or whatever it is we're talking about today. We are noticeably harsher on stories that feature LGBTQ characters or otherwise diverse casts, for example, meticulously examining whether the same gender relationships on She-Ra are healthy representation, than we are on stories that feature about the same level of diversity as the Dead Poets Society. Unfortunately, this is especially true when it comes to stories that are in some ways autobiographical. The intersection of marginalized creators telling stories about their own experiences for some reason tend to be perceived particularly harshly by critic communities. As an example of this, look at some of the response to the cartoon Steven Universe. The show heavily features gay and non-binary characters, and the creator, Rebecca Sugar, is bisexual and non-binary. She stated in the past that she draws inspiration from her own background when creating characters like Ruby and Sapphire, who are in a same-gender relationship, or Stefani, who is the non-binary fusion of two of the main characters. If you watched my last video, you probably already have a sense of what I'm talking about, but there is a large community dedicated solely to talking about how awful the show is called the SU Critical community. A singular search through the tag can pull up a massive volume of results, but a large chunk of these criticisms are dedicated to the idea that the show's LGBTQ representation isn't done right. It's stereotypical, or it's not displayed prominently enough, or it promotes unhealthy relationships. One particular criticism is that Ruby and Sapphire are rarely actually present on the show because for the majority of the time, the two are fused into a singular character, Garnet, who doesn't display romantic interest in any of the characters. As a result, many of the commenters have suggested that Rebecca Sugar doesn't count as an LGBT creator, and many have also resorted to calling her some pretty awful things. See bad media criticism. Interestingly enough, there are numerous children's cartoons that either don't deal with these issues at all or deal with them in much worse ways. For example, Voltron introduced its first gay character recently, only to immediately invoke barrier gaze and kill his partner in a flashback. Gravity Falls didn't feature any gay characters at all until vaguely hinting at a single couple in the very last episode. Googling SU Critical pulls up about 328 million results. Gravity Falls Critical nets about 42 million. Voltron Critical only yields about 500,000. That's not to say that we shouldn't be criticizing Steven Universe at all, or that we should make up for this discrepancy by also calling the creators of Voltron or Gravity Falls thoroughly loathsome people or friendly to fascism or whatever it is people are saying at this point, but it does raise the question of why people are significantly harsher on Steven Universe for its handling of gay characters than arguably worse works that are at about the same level of popularity. On another instance, a Mexican-American young adult author named Erica Sanchez wrote a novel called I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter about a Mexican-American teenager who has to cope with the death of her sister and experiencing depression while growing up. She's explicitly stated in interviews that she drew on her own experiences both living with depression and living as a Mexican-American woman. After her book came out, Erica faced a lot of negative response from Twitter and Goodreads users who felt that she was promoting incorrect stereotypes about either depression or the experience of Latina teenagers. In particular, some people felt that because they found the main character of the book unlikable, the book therefore served as harmful representation of Mexican-American girls. Erica even had to comment on the situation, expressing her frustration with this perspective. Erica's own identity certainly shouldn't absolve her of any criticisms of her book, and that's not to say that people who felt the book portrayed harmful stereotypes about depression or the experience of Mexican-American people were in the wrong, or that these criticisms shouldn't be listened to. But that being said, with regards to calling certain works stereotypical, I think there should at least be some consideration for context when it comes to stories where authors are drawing on their own experiences. If your own personal experience with coming out or dealing with depression or anything else happens to match a series of already popular narratives and you choose to write about it, treating you as indistinguishable from an author who's based their story on popular stereotypes can lead to a lot of missing nuance. And even if you don't think an author's own experiences should factor into how we perceive their art in any way at all, there's still something to be said about how marginalized creators often end up experiencing a harsher level of criticism than other creators. And that's where the iffy part of these discussions comes in, and why it's so easy for them to be co-opted by people acting in bad faith. Of course we should criticize works that poorly handle sensitive subjects. Nothing should be immune to criticism by virtue of the identity of its creators. These discussions can really easily be warped into, one, people responding to all criticism with things like, that episode of Sherlock can't be queerbaiting because it was written by a gay man, or two, people ignoring all nuance regarding how marginalized creators tend to face disproportionately more criticism than other creators, and saying things like, oh, so you're saying we shouldn't criticize Steven Universe because the creator is Jewish or bi or non-binary? That's just meaningless identity politics. At the same time, though, when diverse works get exponentially more criticism and vitriol directed towards them, this can become a contributor to the harassment of marginalized creators and a culture where these mostly indie creators are terrified to put their work out there for fear that they'll fuck up in some small way and be crucified in a way that would never happen to Chadley Millionaire McWhite Dude. And ultimately, I think this leads to worse outcomes in terms of getting diverse works out into the world. I personally have seen some of my trans artist friends say they're scared to write stories about their own experiences for fear that those stories will be viewed as promoting stereotypes. This means, in the long run, that we end up getting fewer of these stories out there, which means that the people controlling the most popular narratives about, for example, trans people are not trans, because trans creators can get bullied and scared into silence in leftist media communities in the way that cis creators with more money and bigger platforms never would. And let's be real, these stories are a lot more likely to be harmful and stereotypical than stories that are autobiographical. This is not good. So what could be causing this? So if you've been watching a lot of video essays lately, you've probably heard the term parasocial relationship come up. If you haven't, the term essentially refers to a one-sided relationship where one party invests a lot of their time and energy while the other person isn't even aware that such a relationship is happening. It's always been a thing to a certain extent. Think people so in love with band members that they dedicate all their time and energy into following them around the world. But of course, it's grown with social media because so much of being a presence on social media is about perceived authenticity. People like watching makeup tutorials where the makeup artist casually chats with the camera because it kind of feels like she's your friend and she's just talking to you. And I think if you feel like you're close with someone and you devote a lot of time and energy into that one-sided relationship, you're gonna feel a lot more let down by them if they do eventually do or say something harmful. Not to mention, if you feel like you know someone, you're probably also going to feel more justified and more able to actively call them out for it in a way that you are less likely to do if you feel distant from the person. If my best friend tweeted something sexist, I would probably feel a lot more personally hurt by that and be a lot more likely to actively respond to that with something like, hey, not cool, than if some random celebrity tweeted it. Of course, these relationships are a lot more likely to form when the person feels accessible to you, right? It's easier for me to feel like I have a personal relationship with Travis McElroy, who makes good morning tweets and asks his Twitter followers for food recommendations all the time, than for me to feel like Taylor Swift is my friend. I mean, we all wish we were Tahani, but... So the first explanation I've seen for why these overly high standards tend to happen is that we're simply more likely to direct excessive negative comments towards people who feel accessible to us. So who's most likely to feel accessible? Who's most likely to make you feel like you could have a personal relationship with them? Well, for one thing, probably not someone who's built up an aura of unapproachability. So probably someone who communicates primarily via channels like social media, which we all use, rather than someone who mostly engages with us through television appearances or press releases. There's also something real about people who run their own social media accounts rather than a rep running it for them. That could mean frequently replying to fans as well. All of these things are probably a lot easier for you to do if you have several thousand, but not several million followers. Someone who's extremely rich is also probably less likely to feel personally relatable to a mainstream audience. So in that way, that kind of authenticity and approachability tends to be negatively correlated to your fame levels. When you get very, very famous and very, very rich, it becomes a lot harder for you to maintain authenticity, which is why you hear a lot of complaints about like makeup YouTubers saying, oh, I really liked her before she got famous. It's just a lot easier for you to feel like you could be friends with a creator if they're not incredibly mega famous and regularly engage with the same people you do. So then you have to think about what kind of person is the most likely to get to that level where they're incredibly successful and have millions of followers on social media. Probably the people more likely to get book deals or get jobs with major TV networks or get hired as video game developers. That group generally doesn't tend to include large numbers of women, people of color, or disabled people, or other marginalized groups. What that means is that according to this explanation, we don't criticize extremely famous people at the very top nearly as much because we don't feel as personally invested in doing so. We don't feel as personally connected to them or as if they're personally connected to us. And those extremely famous people at the top tend to be old white guys. Conversely, we're a lot more active in engaging with people who are active in engaging with us. That often means indie creators with smaller platforms and more engagement with fans who are more likely to not be old white guys. And because we're probably more likely to tweet directly at these creators and give our opinions to them, when fans become disappointed with small indie creators, this can often take the form of abject toxicity. Mix that with a form of selection bias, the fact that woke crowds are probably more likely to be interested in consuming diverse books or TV shows or other forms of media in the first place, and it's easy to see how this could create a recipe for more negative comments being directed towards creators who try and don't get it perfectly than creators who don't try at all. So that's one explanation, and it does make a certain kind of sense. Of course, this can't be the only reason this is happening. Yes, it's easier to form parasocial relationships with creators who have less clout and fame, and people with less clout and fame are also more likely to be marginalized in some way, but assuming that's the only reason is kind of a cop-out, isn't it? This way we don't have to examine any discrepancies in the way we treat creators who are women or people of color or LGBT, etc. The correlation between the way these creators are treated and their lived experience is purely accidental. But in reality, this isn't the case. I mean, we also see diverse works being held to higher standards when it comes to creators who are extremely popular. For example, Lin-Manuel Miranda is very, very rich and famous. Sure, he makes good morning and good night tweets that could make you feel like you have a personal relationship with him, but it's less likely that he's going to personally respond to your tweet than somebody less famous but not visibly marginalized, like a McElroy or Flula. So yes, the presence of parasocial relationships is very likely part of why this media gets held to higher standards, but it can't be the only reason. So why else might this be a problem? This is something a lot of people don't like to admit, but there can be a sort of primal thrill associated with callouts. There's something oddly satisfying in sharing information about someone who's done something wrong and seeing that they got fired from their job or had their book deal canceled. And there's that hit of dopamine associated with putting that information out into the public sphere and having people listen to you. There's not only that emotional incentive to be at the top, to be the one calling the shots and getting people to listen to you when it comes to who we cancel today, but also a very real practical incentive. Once again, Angie Speaks provided some really great analysis in her video as to why this can be the case, but to oversimplify the matter, we live in a capitalist system where we're incentivized to accumulate money and power to survive and thrive in this world. We want as much clout as possible, and a lot of the actions that are profitable also rely on us calling other people out, or refusing to acknowledge our own faults, or using victimhood as a siphon for social capital. The existence of callouts isn't always a bad thing. There are places where we can take those feelings and use them for good, for example, deplatforming fascists so that they're less able to hurt other people. But once again, when we're taking that energy that could be used productively and instead doing our darndest to cancel people who are genuinely making an effort and are dealing with marginalization themselves, we have to ask who we're really helping. And unfortunately, the goal here is rarely actually to help people, but is instead to make ourselves look as good as possible and become the person in our communities with the most powerful voice. I think oftentimes these mass call-out movements against specific figures are started by opportunists who are incentivized by that system to go after creators who are probably not going to have a lot of mainstream support backing them. And we are unfortunately all influenced by societal biases. Leftist spaces aren't immune from subconsciously promoting stereotypes about trans women being more predatory than cis women, or about people of color being inherently more aggressive. When you have the deadly combination of opportunistic people trying to gain clout from attacking an easy target, and the fact that we're already primed to think negative things about marginalized people, we do tend to see a trend towards the least privileged people facing the brunt of online harassment. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone is sitting around rubbing their hands together thinking, ah yes, today we're going to attack 14-year-old Millie Bobby Brown for saying the romance in You was cute instead of attacking an actual abuser, but it ends up being the consequence nevertheless. It's also worth mentioning that the type of criticism these people get is often steeped in these harmful stereotypes. For example, when Rebecca Sugar was accused of pretending to be queer to deflect criticism of Steven Universe, it's worth mentioning that that is a very popular sentiment directed both towards non-binary people and towards bisexual women. Even though the people engaging in these callouts probably weren't consciously thinking of this, these biases can still present themselves in really unfortunate ways and can absolutely affect who we choose to call out and who we don't. That doesn't mean everyone involved in these movements is a terrible opportunist. It's very easy to get misled, especially if you genuinely want to do the right thing and let people know that a work of media has problems associated with it. But even when people aren't intentionally involving themselves in the process, it's sadly very easy to get wrapped up in that sort of perverse glee associated with canceling someone. And when we're all subject to subconscious biases in some sense, it's very possible that the callouts we're more likely to pick up on and share are the callouts that reaffirm those biases. Once again, this isn't always a conscious process. I remember a couple years ago, someone I knew online who is a trans girl received a call-out of her own for liking anime characters and using 4chan arrows. In particular, this girl, who was 17 at the time, was called a pedophile for owning merchandise of the anime character Nico Yazawa, who is also 17. The post was shared around 3,500 times. Admittedly, some of those shares were defending her, and I doubt that every single person sharing the post to call her out was thinking, ah yes, I knew it, trans women are predatory. The post itself still definitely included rhetoric promoting harmful stereotypes about trans women. Again, this leaves us in such a tough position because people who are marginalized are absolutely capable of doing bad things or creating bad media. See my earlier example about Sherlock. One of the lead writers is a gay man, but the show still definitely contains multiple instances of queerbaiting. What happens when someone is predatory or does mishandle important subjects in the media they create? We can't simply lose all nuance the other way around and say we can't criticize this person because they have this identity and we don't want to be problematic. So how do we know when criticisms are legitimate or when we're applying them correctly? How do we go about fixing this whole issue in a way that's productive and doesn't simply lead to more people getting hurt? This is just such a difficult issue to look at. Again, it's so easy for these issues to be co-opted by the same opportunists I talked about earlier, and none of us are immune to subconscious bias or propaganda. I mean, I myself have faced criticism for the same idea. When my bad media criticism video came out, some people didn't like the fact that I spent a decent chunk of time talking about Lily Orchard's Steven Universe video instead of focusing on another creator. Even though my criticism of her arguments had nothing to do with the fact that she's transgender, many of the people were still saying that it wasn't fair that, on a large scale, Lily had to deal with more criticism than her counterparts. I honestly hadn't thought of it that way before, and after hearing multiple conflicting opinions from people I respect, I'm still not sure what to think. Do we just not criticize creators at all when they fuck up on the basis that they're marginalized? Something about that seems condescending. If I said something wrong and people refused to engage with what I said on the basis of my identities, I'd probably be pretty offended. Not to mention, this can put more people in a position where they can be hurt. Or should we just keep doing what we're doing but apply that same level of criticism to non-diverse works? Maybe, but that can ignore the fact that, like I said earlier, a lot of the criticism directed towards marginalized creators is often steeped in harmful stereotypes. We should still be doing a degree of introspection to prevent this from happening. But overall, I think a good starting point for change is to remove this presumption of ill intent when we're criticizing media. I mean, I think that would be a good thing to do in general, but in this specific case, this could look like maybe not assuming every writer is familiar with harmful tropes and educating them about it in a productive way instead of gleefully trying to tear them down. especially creators who are just starting out and don't have massive piles of money and ghostwriters to fall back on. This also means maybe not leaving 1-star reviews on Goodreads for a book that hasn't come out yet that you haven't read because you heard some third-hand information that one of the characters was homophobic and missed the part where that character was a villain who you're supposed to hate. Finally, that means doing everything we can to remove our own subconscious biases. Once again, no one is ever going to be perfect, but we can still try and do our best to minimize the harm we do to others on a large scale. That can mean surrounding ourselves with people whose struggles we haven't personally experienced and being willing to accept when we make a mistake. And when we do stop and find ourselves being excessively harsher towards marginalized creators than we are to other creators, it's worth stopping, taking notice of that, and asking ourselves if that's the best possible use of our energy. That doesn't mean never criticizing media made by marginalized people or silencing criticisms from people who feel like a work of fiction has hurt them in some way, but simply by being aware of when and where we direct things like a presumption of ill intent, we can at least start to unpack the issue of differing standards in media criticism. This isn't perfect, and it isn't a one-stop solution to these issues. The truth is, it's a really complex problem that's steeped in a lot of societal biases and complex interconnected issues. But even being aware of the issue and asking ourselves if we're devoting our energy in ways that are actively productive or actively destructive can at least be a starting point. There are a lot of double standards present in the way we look at media, and this can often manifest itself in us being unduly harsh towards creators who are not perfect but are trying. This is doubly present when it comes to creators who are already marginalized for a variety of reasons. On one hand, we do tend to feel as though we have a closer personal relationship with small indie creators, which can lead to us feeling even more betrayed when those creators let us down in some ways. But there's also something very real to be said about how our own subconscious biases can play into who we choose to criticize and for what reasons. The consequences of this can be really harmful for aspiring creators and can create a culture of fear. When people are scared to tell their own stories for fear that these stories might be viewed as stereotypical in some way and that they'll be harassed to an extent that other creators never would be, people can be deterred from telling those stories. Ultimately, that means that we get fewer really great, well-written, diverse works out there, even if those works do have a few problems, because people become so afraid of potential backlash that they don't put their works out there. And that's not good for anyone. The solution isn't to stop criticizing harmful works, but instead to start being aware of our own subconscious biases and double standards. We need to start thinking about who we assume has malicious intent and who we assume just made a mistake. And we need to start thinking about how we're creating and upholding systems that reward people for publicly harassing creators. This isn't a problem that we're going to fix overnight, but at the very least, creating this awareness can serve as a starting point. Snappy exit line. On top of a special thank you to all my patrons, I would also like to specifically thank Comfy Hat, Eric Campbell, and Paul Walker for joining my $20 plus Patreon tier. Welcome.